Well, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, whenever you may be joining us here today. Uh, when we last met, we looked at and finished Genesis chapter 15, and today we're going to jump into chapter 16. Now, if we remember right, in chapter 15, we saw God reiterate and make this promise to Abram, who's going to become Abraham eventually, right? That his descendants were going to be so numerous and God would provide for him and stuff like that. It will eventually become to be called what we know as the Abrahamic covenant. And in chapter 16, we're going to see that uh, when we try to take matters into our own hands, it very rarely ends the way that we'd like it to. And in chapter 16, Abram and Sarai are going to make a huge mistake that sets up things for literally the rest of time that we've seen, and it's not in a good way. So we're going to be in chapter 16. As always, if you have comments, questions, concerns, that sort of thing, leave them down below, whether you're on Facebook or YouTube, and we'll jump into it. Chapter 16 of the book of Genesis. We're going to take a look at the whole chapter here today. Now Sarai, Abram's wife, had borne him no children, but she had an Egyptian maidservant named Hagar. She said to Abram, "The Lord has kept me from having children. Go, sleep with my maidservant. Perhaps I can build a family through her." Abram agreed to what Sarai said. So after Abram had been living in Canaan 10 years, Sarai, his wife, took her Egyptian maidservant Hagar and gave her to her husband to be his wife. He slept with Hagar, and she conceived. When she knew she was pregnant, she began to despise her mistress. Then Sarai said to Abram, "You're responsible for the wrong I am suffering. I put my servant in your arms, and now that she knows she is pregnant, she despises me. May the Lord judge between you and me." "Your servant is in your hands," Abram said. "Do with her whatever you think best." Then Sarai mistreated Hagar, so she fled from her. The angel of the Lord found Hagar near a spring in the desert. It was a spring that is beside the road to Shur. And he said, "Hagar, servant of Sarai, where have you come from and where are you going?" "I'm running away from my mistress Sarai," she answered. Then the angel of the Lord told her, "Go back to your mistress and submit to her." The angel added, "I will so increase your descendants that they will be too numerous to count." The angel of the Lord also said to her, "You are now with child, and you will have a son. You shall name him Ishmael, for the Lord has heard of your misery. He will be a wild donkey of a man. His hand will be against everyone, and everyone's hand against him, and he will live in hostility toward all his brothers." She gave this name to the Lord who spoke to her. "You are the God who sees me." For she said, "I have now seen the one who sees me." That is why the well was called Bir Leah Roy, it is still there between Kadesh and Bered. So Hagar bore Abram a son, and Abram gave the name Ishmael to the son she had born. Abram was 86 years old when Hagar bore him Ishmael. So let's dive into this and talk about this because this is a huge deal that, like I said already, is going to have repercussions for, I mean, thousands of years going forward. So in this chapter, we already mentioned we see this age-old idea that God helps those who help themselves, and that is a terrible thing. Um, that is, you will find that nowhere in Scripture that actual idea. God helps those whom He decides He's going to help, and usually those whom are willing to rely upon Him for what they need and what God has said. God has told Abram, and Abram then would have told Sarai, "Listen, God's going to give us an heir, and through you." And there, Sarai especially is getting impatient. We'll talk about her in a little bit here because I think we can understand why she'd be getting impatient. But we'll talk about her in a little bit. Um, Actually, you know what? Let's talk about her first. It was Sarai's faith who weakens first. She felt the shame of her barrenness and makes a decision that she no doubt detested. The only solution that she saw was to share Abram with another. Make no mistake, she failed first in this test. Abram's going to fail as well. She fails first in this test. It has nothing to do with her being a woman, so she's weaker. It does have to do with that this specific thing is an area that is generally going to be harder on a woman than it is on a man, not being able to bear children, right? Is generally in our world going to be a harder thing to deal with and walk through than it is for a man to do so. And so it kind of makes sense. We hold a lot against Sarai, and we're going to see that she's not perfect by any means, right? She has some issues. We hold a lot against her, but I think it's important for us to put ourselves in her shoes, right? She is, if Abram is 86, then she's in her mid 70s or so. Um, and and she hasn't had children yet, and she's been promised this, but she's had to wait and wait and wait and wait, and eventually her faith fails her. I think when we put ourselves in her shoes, we can understand, we can see where this is coming from, and I think that's important for us to remember. Um, so Abram, right? Abram would have been 85 most likely when this happens, and Sarai would be 75 then, right? We get base that off of Abram being 86, so it's possible he's 86 at this point, but he's from what scripture says, he's either 85 when Sarai goes to him or 86 when Sarai goes to him. It depends on how fast Hagar conceives, it depends on birthdays that we don't know, all that fun jazz, right? So 85, 86 years old. And her maid would have been, Hagar would have been in effect her property. And thus any children she had in this arrangement would have been legally Sarai's. It would have been legally the descendant of Abraham and of Abram and Sarai. We don't really think about that today. It's not something that in American culture we really have, but that's the way it was back then in that culture. And Abram repeats the same mistake that Adam and countless other men have. He falls to temptation. Yes, he listened to Sarai, but ultimately the decision was his. And Abram should have stood up and said no for a number of reasons. First off and foremost, because it's just simply wrong, right? We believe the Bible very clearly teaches in things like monogamy and only having sex within your marriage with your wife or your husband, right? And so for that reason, Abram should have said no. The second reason Abram should have said no was because God had made a promise to him, and not even a promise where you're like, "Wow, man, it's this vague sort." No, this was a specific promise that is made to Abram and no one else. And Abram doesn't do it because he falls to temptation. On the flip side of that, wives, let this be a warning to you. You have incredible power over your husbands. Use it well. This is not, don't misunderstand me. I'm not putting all of this on Sarai's shoulders, although she is the one who brings the idea up first, right? Both Abram and Sarai have their failings in this matter. Men, let this be a warning to you. Be wary of your lusts, control them. Run from lust, control it, and rest on the promises of God. Women, rest on the promises of God and recognize the power that you do have over men and wield it well. Wield it and use it to help spur men on towards righteousness and holiness instead of spurring them on towards sin. You've heard me say before, if you come to church here or if you watch some of our other videos, that I'm a firm believer in the idea that behind every great man, you'll find an equally, if not greater, woman who is spurring him on. And behind every disastrous, evil man, you will find a worse woman, whether it's a mother, a wife, a girlfriend, etc., who is spurring him on towards evil. Women, understand the power you have. Men, understand the power that women have, especially physically, over you, and work against it in your own life to live a life that God has called you to. Both Sarai and Abram have their failings in this endeavor. And you know what? Maybe Abram, Sarai, or even Hagar had worthy, unselfish motives. But going against God's creative purposes will always create and cause problems. No matter how pure your motives are, if you go against what God has laid down, it will only create problems. And eventually we will see some of the problems that this creates. So Hagar gets pregnant. It says that she begins to despise her master, Sarai. And so Sarai goes to Abram and starts complaining about Hagar. And Abram allows her to deal harshly with Hagar. He says, listen, she's your maidservant. Do with her what you will. Again, that's a failing, I believe, on Abram's part. He needed to stand up to his wife and say, no, listen, this situation is not good. You also will not treat her terribly. He doesn't. And Hagar runs away. And even in this, we see the grace of God. We see God's grace. So most likely God deals very kindly with Hagar in part because this situation isn't her fault, right? Could and should she have said no? Yes, but she's also in a situation where she really doesn't have a lot of choice in the matter. And so in a lot of ways, right? We always have a choice to sin or not to sin, right? We always have that choice. Um, but she's a piece of property essentially. And I'm not defending slavery here by any means. Please don't misunderstand me. Um, and so this wasn't her fault. She didn't do this. And God shows grace and mercy on her. And God knows she's probably trying to get home to Egypt. And God knows that she's not going to make it. She's heavily pregnant um, in the desert. She's not going to make it. And so God comes and tells her what to do. God comes down and shows grace and mercy on her. This is the first use of the angel of the Lord. And oftentimes when we see it, especially in the Old Testament here, it is the image of a pre-incarnate Christ, right? Not necessarily an angel itself, but literally Christ before he comes on earth in dwell not in the form of man, not in dwelt. Don't I misspoke there. In the form of a man, um, and um, so this is most likely literally Christ, and he talks to her. And this interaction shows us that God is interested in all of us. So often you'll hear people talk about, well, God is only this, God's only that. God's love extends to every single person. Now, we can talk sometime about what that means for salvation and stuff like that, because frankly, not everyone, in fact, most won't be saved. But that's because of them, not because of God. God calls her by her name, Hagar. He doesn't say, well, what is this? He goes, Hagar. He tells her the son's name, Ishmael, which means God hears. This whole encounter, it would be a constant reminder to her and to Abram and everyone else that it was God, not a random false God, that Hagar would have served during her time in Egypt, that it was God, Yahweh, though he hasn't given us that name yet. He won't for another couple hundred years. It is the true God that took care of her, that takes care of her. And I notice, notice this, that the promise given to Abram is that he will have so many descendants. And he makes the same promise now to Ishmael, or to Hagar through Ishmael. And what we actually see is this split that's going to occur eventually. We won't get there yet today, but the split that's going to occur where Isaac and his line becomes what we know as the Jews. And Ishmael and his line becomes what we know as the Arabs and Muslims. And those two groups, they are fighting right now, right? Literally right now. Those two groups have been fighting for thousands of years now. And it all would have been um, avoided if if Abram and Sarai had just done the right thing. Most of the time, when we make the choice to walk away or to try to put something in our own hands, doesn't affect the entirety of the world. And for as long lasting as Abram and Sarai's choices do here, but they do affect the people around us when we choose not to do or to try to take matters into our own hands. So that's what we see. He goes back to Sarai, Hagar, excuse me, goes back to Abram and Sarai. They give birth. Whether God appears to Abram or influences him to name the child Ishmael, or what is more likely, Hagar tells this tale to Abram, and so Abram dutifully names their son Ishmael. We don't know what happened. Most likely it's the latter, but we don't know. But we do see here one of the things, and as we're ending here today, I want to take a minute and just talk about this. One of the cool things we see in Scripture is that so many of these people, Adam and Eve, Noah, that we've talked about so far, Abram, like we're talking about now, we're going to talk about Isaac, Jacob, so on and so forth, all the way down, David, throughout the New Testament. All these men and women that we hold up as godly people, right? When you read in Hebrews chapter 11, the hall of faith, and you see these incredible people of God, all of them were just humans who made mistakes still. They still sin. Now, don't misunderstand me. I'm not giving us a leave to sin or anything like that. What I am saying is, though, how beautiful is it that God God uses us in our weaknesses, right? As we're reading through this passage of scripture and continuing on, you're going to see that more and more that God uses us in spite and in our weaknesses. He doesn't ask us to know everything. He just asks us simply to follow and do what he says. Follow him. And how beautiful is it that when we stray away, when we try to take matters into our own hands or whatever it is, he pulls us back and he says, hey, nope, keep following me. It's a beautiful thing. Take encouragement in that today, that God still uses, despite our failings and our iniquities. God still uses us. It's a beautiful thing. As always, like, share, comment. Follow us on Instagram now. It's FBC on First Baptist Church. New Milford on Instagram. Our social media person is doing a great job with a lot of that stuff. So you're going to want to follow us there as well. Facebook, YouTube, Instagram. Comment and share and like, and we'll see you guys all in our next video. God bless and have a great week. Thanks, guys.